の来てるんですか？
いや、ラジオです。
ありがとうございます。
なるほど。なんかお仕事とかって何かされたりしてます？
皆さんからのメッセージとリクエストお待ちしています。パソコンやスマートフォンからメッセージを送る場合はここカフェのホームページから。
どうしてこういう場所に住まれようっていうのは？
行く場所がないから、そりゃそうやろ。
Looking at Japan from the outside, it looks like a model country in many ways. The third largest economy in the world with world-renowned companies, extremely safe cities, a healthy population, and advanced technology and automation everywhere. But beneath the surface, Japan is struggling, and most of its biggest problems are with the lost generation. The millions of people who have failed to succeed in the tough Japanese job market and failed through system cracks. The sad story of a lost generation is a symbol of Japan's fall from grace and a sign of its troubled future. By 1970, Japan had been growing extremely fast for 3 consecutive decades, and it became the second biggest economy after the United States. By the end of the 1980s, this growth went into overdrive and turned into a speculative mania. The Japanese economic system was based on cooperation between gigantic corporate cartels and the Japanese government. These alliances were given access to an infinite stream of cash to finance their aggressive expansion abroad, while at the same time, the government would block foreign companies from entering the market. In 1990, the bubble popped. Throughout the year 1990, the stock market fell by 43%, and real estate prices were followed by an end of the economic boom. Corruption was widespread in Japanese businesses and governments, from inside trading to stock manipulation and fraud and bribery, and the practically unlimited supply of loans created hundreds of zombie companies and companies that would have gone bankrupt years ago, but that kept surviving on the never-ending supply of cheap money borrowed from the state. In 1 decade, Japan went from being called an economic tiger riding the Japan's miracle to being called the sick man of Asia. But while this was a drastic downfall, it wasn't that those unique economies of different countries go up and down, and that's part of life. But in Japan, it was different, unlike in other countries. The economic downturn in Japan had devastating effects for a whole generation, effects that millions of people have never recovered from. So why was that? Well, to answer that, we need to understand the Japanese work and hiring culture, which is, to put it mildly, very intense, and it has several unique aspects that make it quite different from any other job market in the world. A corporate career in Japan starts with Shushoku Katsudo, a unique Japanese job hunting ritual that university graduates go through at the end of their studies. Many companies, including the biggest Garetsu, hire only fresh graduates only once a year, but in mass loads of people at once, the fresh graduates pass the job hunting ritual filled with group interviews and seminars that thousands of people dressed in identical black and white suits have to go through, and at the end of it, they get a job and they keep their job for decades until retirement, in line with another common policy known as Shushin Koyo, or lifetime employment. And their company will then only promote from within a policy known as Shanichoshen, grooming and cultivating their employees throughout their careers to become future executives. One day, these practices, which were basically the universal standard in the 1990s and are still very common in Japan to this day, bring stability. But they also create an incredibly rigid job market. If you want to get a good job, you have one shot after university. And once you are hired, you stick with the company for the rest of your career. But if you fail to do that, you're left out in the cold, and the doors of most companies will remain closed to you forever. The point is that when the economic bubble burst and the economic boom ended, this ritual was broken. While during the boom, it was not that hard to get at least some corporate job. After 1990, most companies froze their hiring entirely for almost the entire decade, and they were not hiring any graduates at all to keep all of their lifelong employees during the economic crisis. They eventually resumed their hiring in the new century, although finding a job became much harder ever since. But for a whole generation of people who graduated in the 1990s, it was too late. They were not graduates anymore by then. And so the companies would not hire them as they were hiring fresh graduates. Instead, those people whose only fault was being born at the wrong time missed their shock and fell through the cracks of the system. And a whole generation, millions of people were left behind, destined to spend the rest of their lives on temporary, part-time, low-paid jobs. This period became known as the Employment Ice Age, and people who graduated during that time as the Lost Generation. Since the Japanese economy never fully recovered, more young people graduated in the 2000s, and then 2010s joined their ranks. 15% of the population, almost 17 million people, are considered part of the Lost Generation. They were never economically secure enough to start families of their own, and they never had proper jobs and careers and now become hikikomori. So-called hikikomori is Japanese men who have decided to completely cut themselves from society. They're spending their lives in complete isolation, never leaving their house and not having any social contacts at all, usually being completely financially dependent on their parents. Today, there are almost 1 million of these men in Japanese society, with many more on the verge of joining them. The government has announced that it'll try to help the lost generation, but so far it has had very little success.